The train still passes through the town at 7:03 every evening. Elias hadn't heard that sound in years. Not since he was a boy, barefoot in the backyard watching the stars, with questions too heavy for his age. Now, at 40, he stood in his late grandmother's living room, the same wood-paneled walls, the same scent of anointing oil and lemon balm. Grief has a strange way of unsealing memories. And when he opened that cedar chest by her prayer chair, he found himself staring at childhood drawings, old journals, and verses she had underlined just for him. Words like, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." Jeremiah 1:5. And that's when the ache returned. Not of pain, but of remembering. He hadn't been a normal child. He had felt too deeply, seen too much, dreamed too wildly. For years he called it weird, but maybe it was holy. Maybe the moments that once made him feel lost were actually the moments he was being led. And maybe, just maybe, what he thought were childhood struggles were sacred signs. "This is not just a story," Elias whispered, running his hand over his grandmother's final note. "This is my awakening, part 2. Set apart in silence, you carried the mark of the outsider." Elias always sat by himself. It wasn't that he didn't like people, he just never knew how to be like them. In second grade, while the other boys traded baseball cards and mimicked wrestlers, Elias drew pictures of angels, not the sweet kind with harps, the fierce kind with flaming swords. He'd never seen one, not with his eyes, but somehow he just knew what they looked like. Lunchtime was the hardest. The cafeteria was loud, sticky, and full of rules that no one wrote but everyone followed. Who you could sit with, who you had to laugh at, who you better not defend. Elias didn't fit into any of those categories, so he found a quiet table near the window. Every day he opened his lunchbox, sketched galaxies in the corner of his napkin, and listened to the noise without ever joining it. He wasn't lonely, but he was alone. Some days, that truth sank like a stone in his stomach. He wondered if something in him was broken, why fitting in felt like acting, why his thoughts seemed 5 years older than his age. Once, during art class, the teacher asked everyone to draw their families. While others scribbled smiling stick figures, Elias drew his mother asleep at the table, bills unopened, a Bible beside her hand. He shaded the dark under her eyes, the light above her head. The teacher pulled him aside afterward. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just said, "You see things other people." He looked at her, startled. "That's not weird," she added. "That's rare." That word followed him home that day. Rare. He whispered it to himself like a secret blessing. Still, being different came with a cost. Kids teased him for his quiet, for the way he stared off like he was listening to someone no one else could hear. Once a boy shoved him and called him Space Case. Elias didn't fight back. He just picked up his notebook, walked away, and cried behind the school's oak tree. Not because of the insult, but because deep down he believed it might be true. That night, Mama Essie found him sitting in the hallway, hugging his knees. "They don't see you yet," she said, kneeling beside him. "But heaven does." He didn't reply. She tilted his chin up. "You're not behind. You're hidden. There's a difference." He blinked. "Jesus was hidden too," she whispered, "till it was time." And suddenly, the silence didn't feel so heavy. As the years passed, Elias still walked his own path. He never got loud to be liked, never lowered his truth to fit in. He let the world misunderstand him, because deep down he had learned a truth that never left him. He wasn't set aside, he was set apart, and being different wasn't a flaw, it was a fingerprint, proof that heaven had touched him and didn't want the world to wipe it off. Part 1. The hidden sensitivity. You felt what others ignored. Elias didn't know why he cried that night. The house was quiet. The television buzzed faintly in the background. A game show, maybe? His cousins laughed somewhere in the other room. But Elias was outside, lying in the grass, barefoot, listening to nothing and everything. The sky above him was fading from blue to indigo, and his tears rolled quietly down his cheeks. He wasn't sure what hurt, only that something did. Earlier that day, his teacher, Miss Raynor, had walked into class with her usual smile, but something about it felt wrong. The corners of her mouth curled like always, but her eyes were somewhere else. They lingered too long on the window. Her voice cracked when she said, "Present." No one else noticed. No one cared. But Elias did. He had always felt things too deeply, too suddenly, too much. He couldn't explain how one woman's silence could make his heart ache, but it did. It always had. Strangers, classmates, even animals. He felt when something was off, like heaven had given him antennas no one else could see. And for a long time he thought something was wrong with him. That's when he heard the door creak. "Out here again, little preacher." Mama Essie's voice wrapped around him like a warm quilt. She didn't ask why he was crying. She never did. She just sat beside him, placed a folded blanket in his lap, and handed him a glass of sweet tea. For a while, they just sat in the silence, watching the fireflies blink in the dusk. Then she said softly, "You know what a tuning fork is?" Elias shook his head. "It's a little tool. You strike it and it starts to hum. But here's the thing, if there's another tuning fork nearby, even if you don't touch it, it'll start humming too." He looked at her, confused. "That's you," she said. "God made your heart like that. You pick up the pain around you. Doesn't have to touch you. It still moves you." His lip trembled. "But it hurts, Grandma. I don't like it." "I know, baby," she whispered. "But listen close now. The heart that feels the deepest is the one heaven trusts the most." That night, Elias stopped asking God to make him normal. He stopped begging to be numb. He started wondering if maybe, just maybe, this pain wasn't punishment. Maybe it was permission. Maybe God let him feel everything because he needed someone willing to weep when the world didn't. Years later, in hospital rooms, quiet phone calls, and front porches full of strangers pouring their hearts out, Elias would remember her words. When people said, "I've never told anyone this before," or "I don't know why I'm crying," Elias would smile gently and think, "You don't have to. God already knew. That's why he sent me." They called him too emotional, too intense, too much. But heaven called him and that made all the difference. God's chosen ones, these 7 childhood signs prove you were marked long before you knew. Have you ever wondered why you felt too much too soon? Why you cried at things no one else noticed? Why silence felt safer than crowds? Why the pain of others pierced you deeper than words could explain? Before you even had language for it, you felt different. Not broken, but burdened. Not dramatic, but divine, marked by something heaven whispered over you long before the world gave you a name. You didn't imagine it. You weren't too sensitive. You were chosen, because some children weren't just born, they were sent. And if you've carried that ache your whole life, this isn't just a story, it's a confirmation. If you are God's chosen one, this message was written in heaven with your name on it. Part 3. The Divine Compass. You knew before you knew. It happened during a storm, the kind that rattled window panes and made the trees bow like they were praying. Elias was 11. He had fallen asleep with a flashlight in one hand and a pencil in the other, a half-finished drawing of a lighthouse on his lap. Rain tapped the window, thunder rolled, but it wasn't the storm that woke him. It was the dream. In the dream, he saw fire. Not fire like punishment, fire like warning. It was coming from a plug socket in his mother's office. Cords tangled, sparks hissing. He sat up, drenched in sweat, heart racing, mouth dry. He stumbled down the hallway barefoot, calling, "Mama?" His mother, still awake at the kitchen table with bills spread out like battle plans, looked up startled. "You okay, baby?" "Please don't go to work tomorrow," he whispered, voice shaking. "Something's going to happen. There's going to be a fire, I saw it." She stared at him, long and hard. For a moment he thought she'd laugh, say it was just a dream, just fear. But she didn't. She stood up, walked over and touched his forehead. Not to check for fever, but to feel what he was carrying. The next day she called in sick. By 4:17 p.m. the building caught fire. An electrical short in the very wall she always sat beside. No one was hurt, but the office was gone. Elias didn't speak for the rest of the day. That night he sat in the living room, knees to his chest, shaking, not from fear, but from knowing. He hadn't guessed, he hadn't imagined. He had heard something, or someone, inside his sleep. Mama Essie came over quietly. "You listened," she said. "That's all God needs." He looked at her, terrified. "But how did I know?" She smiled. "Because you were never walking blind. God didn't give you eyes to see trees. He gave you eyes to see truth." From then on, Elias noticed it more often. That quiet nudge when something wasn't right. That whisper that made him leave a place 5 minutes before trouble started. The peace that wrapped around him like a shield in moments that should have broken him. Once a man at church told him, "Boy, you got old wisdom in young skin." But it wasn't just wisdom. It was something deeper. A compass, a pull, an invisible voice pointing left when the crowd ran right. He didn't always obey it. Sometimes he ignored it and paid for it. But every time he listened, every time he followed that inner whisper, he was spared. He didn't call it intuition anymore. He called it what it was. The shepherd's voice. Soft, subtle, sacred. Not loud like fear, but clear like peace. And he learned something else too. God doesn't always explain. He just directs. Because those who are truly chosen don't need all the answers, just enough trust to walk. Part 4. The Justice Cry. You carried heaven's heart for what's right. They told him to let it go. It's not your business, Elias, just ignore it. But he couldn't. He was 10 when he first stood between a lie and the truth, trembling, small, but unshaken. It happened on the playground. Mateo, a shy boy with a stutter, had dropped his lunch. The bigger kid, loud, sharp, always watching for weakness, snatched it up and laughed like it was a game. The other kids laughed too, not because it was funny, but because it was safer than being next. Elias stood still for a moment, watching. His fists clenched, his stomach twisted. Something rose inside him, not anger exactly, something deeper. He walked over, planted himself between Mateo and the mocker, and said, voice low, "Give it back." The laughter died. "What you gonna do, preacher boy?" the bully sneered. Elias didn't move. He didn't yell. He just stared. And for a split second, the older boy looked confused. Like he saw something in Elias's eyes he couldn't explain. Not fear, not fight, but fire. The lunch bag was dropped. The crowd scattered. Matteo didn't say anything, but his eyes welled up. Elias handed him the bag, sat beside him, and said nothing. He didn't need to. That night, Elias cried in his room, not because of the confrontation, but because no one else had done anything. He prayed, "God, why does it hurt when people stay quiet?" The answer came as a whisper in his spirit. "Because I gave you my heart, and my heart breaks for the voiceless." It wasn't the first time he'd felt it, this deep pull toward what was right, even when it cost him. He remembered speaking up in Sunday school when a scripture was twisted out of context. He remembered telling his uncle not to joke about someone's weight, even when everyone else laughed. He remembered asking his mum why the homeless man on their street didn't have a coat in December and giving him his own. Every time he paid a price. Mocked, misunderstood, called too serious, too soft, too much. But even at that age, Elias understood something most adults never did. Justice isn't always about courts and causes. Sometimes it's about courage. It's about saying something when everyone else stays silent. It's about doing what's right when it's easier not to. He began to see his fire not as rebellion, but as reflection. As a reflection of God's heart. A God who doesn't ignore the bullied. A God who flips tables in temples. A God who walks into broken places and says, "Not on my watch." Years later, when he preached his first sermon, Elias opened with this: "I didn't choose justice. Justice chose me. It called me when I was too young to spell it, but old enough to feel its fire in my bones." He smiled as he said it, not out of pride, but out of peace. Because by then he understood. He wasn't angry. He was anointed. And when heaven places its heart inside a child, that child will never be okay with silence again. Part 5. The Dream Builder. Your creativity was prophetic. Elias didn't play with toys the way other kids did. While the neighborhood boys built towers just to knock them down, he was sketching blueprints. Not from cartoons or comics, but from something that lived inside his head. Inside his spirit, really. He once spent an entire Saturday building a structure from cardboard and glue. It had archways, windows, even a secret passage. He called it the shelter. When asked what it was for, he shrugged and said softly, "For when the storms come." No one had told him a storm was coming. But 2 months later, a tornado hit the next town over. He watched the news and whispered, "That's what I saw." No one believed him, but it kept happening. Visions in the form of dreams. Dreams in the form of designs. Ideas he couldn't trace to anything he had seen, only what he felt. One night, he drew an invention, a bag that collected rain and filtered it into drinking water. The next morning, in school, his teacher showed them a video of a missionary organization doing the same thing in Africa. He stared at the screen, stunned, not because he was impressed, but because he had already seen it. Elias didn't know it then, but his creativity was not just cleverness. It was consecration. When he painted, it wasn't about beauty. It was about decoding something only his spirit understood. His bedroom walls were covered with strange maps, buildings, cities, and verses. Not because he wanted to escape the world, but because something in him knew he was called to rebuild it. It's not. Once his mother looked at his sketch of a city built on light. No wires, no shadows, just energy flowing like rivers. She laughed. "That's too much, baby. Ain't nobody ever gonna build that." But Mama Essie leaned over and said, "Not yet. But maybe he's not building for now. Maybe he's building for heaven." And Elias looked at his drawing and smiled, because deep down he knew his dreams weren't just his. They were instructions. God was whispering blueprints into his imagination. not just for buildings, but for lives, for systems, for sermons, for structures that didn't yet exist but needed to. That's why he was always restless in school, why he asked questions the textbooks didn't answer, why silence never meant his mind wasn't moving. It was always moving, between dimensions, between the possible and the prophetic. He once told a friend, "I don't make this stuff up, I just receive it." That friend laughed. But years later, when Elias became a man, it was those very crazy ideas that helped him start his ministry, a center that fed the hungry, housed the forgotten, and turned visions into blueprints of mercy. Not because he was brilliant, but because he remembered something sacred. Creativity is not for applause, it's for assignment. And his assignment had begun long before he had the words to name it. He was never too imaginative. He was too anointed to copy the crowd. Part 6. The Childhood Trials. You carried adult storms in a small frame. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and sadness. Elias sat alone, legs dangling from the stiff plastic chair, hands clenched in his lap. He was 13. Too old to cry in public, too young to pretend he wasn't afraid. His mother was behind those double doors. Emergency surgery, complications. Words he didn't fully understand, but could feel like thunder in his chest. The nurse had offered him a lollipop. He didn't take it. What he needed wasn't sugar, it was presence. So he prayed. Not out loud, not with fancy words, just a quiet whisper into his shaking hands. God, please, don't let her leave me. There was no thunderous voice in reply, no lightning bolt, but a warmth wrapped around him like invisible arms. Peace, heavy and holy. For the first time, Elias realized he wasn't alone. Not in that room. Not in this world. His tears stopped, not because the fear left, but because something greater had entered. The nurse returned, surprised. "You okay, sweetheart?" Elias nodded. "I'm not by myself." She smiled, politely, not understanding, but he did. That night, when the surgery was over and his mother squeezed his hand with tired fingers, he knew something had changed. Not just in her body, but in him. He had crossed a threshold, faced a storm that would have drowned most boys, and walked through it carrying a faith too big for his frame. He never told anyone about the panic attack he had in the bathroom stall, or how he almost vomited from fear, or how, right before peace came, he heard a voice, not from outside but from deep within. This is what strength feels like, while it's still forming. Elias never forgot that moment, because from then on, whenever life hit hard, when his family lost their home, when his uncle died suddenly, when the lights got cut off and the prayers went unanswered, he remembered that chair, that room, that warmth, and he whispered the same prayer. God, don't let me break. And God didn't. He bent, he shook, but he never broke. Because what people never understood was that Elias didn't develop resilience as an adult. He was forged in it as a child. He didn't earn his wisdom. He survived into it. And long before he preached his first sermon, long before he stood behind pulpits and led others into healing, he sat in cold waiting rooms, alone and unseen, passing tests he didn't study for, but somehow passed anyway. He was never coddled, he was called. And when others questioned how he stayed standing after the storms he walked through, he simply smiled and said, God trained me when nobody was looking. Part 7. The God encounter. You were claimed before you were named. He didn't expect anything that night. The tent revival was halfway through summer, and the air was thick with humidity and hallelujahs. People danced, cried, clapped. Elias stood in the back, arms crossed, unsure why he even came. He was 14, old enough to question everything, too old to cry in public, too young to know he was standing on hope. The preacher wasn't famous. He didn't shout like the others. He just opened his Bible, paused, and said quietly, "Some of y'all have been hiding your calling since childhood, but God never forgot your name." Something snapped open in Elias. His knees buckled. No tears at first, just a silence so deep it roared inside his chest. The preacher kept talking, but Elias couldn't hear any more, because something else, someone else, had entered the room. No spotlight, no voice from heaven, just fire. It didn't burn his skin. It burned his knowing. He dropped to his knees in the sawdust, shoulders shaking, not from shame, but from finally feeling seen. He wasn't repenting. He was remembering the nights he cried alone and called it weakness, the drawings that came from dreams no one understood, the whispers he heard when rooms were quiet and the world felt loud, the weight he carried when no one else noticed the burden. He hadn't made any of it up. He had been marked. He was never just a boy. He was a messenger. And now the messenger had come to claim him. That night, Elias didn't give his life to God. He discovered it already belonged to him. When he opened his eyes, the room hadn't changed, but everything inside him had. He looked around. Same crowd, same lights, same preacher, but he was different. He was claimed. That night, as people danced around him and the preacher moved on to the next verse, Elias stayed on the ground. Not because he couldn't stand, but because something sacred had settled in his soul. Later, when Mama Essie saw him, she didn't ask what happened. She just nodded, eyes glistening. "You finally heard him," she whispered. "Ill." Elias didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had felt the claiming, like a whisper that thundered through his bones. "You are mine. You've always been mine." And from that moment forward, Elias never doubted the fire inside him again. Because once heaven marks you, no one and nothing can unmark you. This was never random. It was written. The cedar chest creaked as it closed. Elias stood in the center of the room where his grandmother once prayed, sunlight slicing through the blinds like golden thread. The scent of frankincense still lingered, faint but familiar. In his hands were the drawings he once sketched as a child. Visions, warnings, blueprints. What he used to call daydreams he now knew were evidence. He sat down slowly, unfolding the worn paper where Mama Essie had written in her steady hand. It was set apart before the world could name him. His eyes welled, not from grief, but from awakening, because he finally understood. He was never too sensitive, never too strange, never too serious. He was seen, he was shaped, he was chosen. The signs were there all along, in the way he cried for people without knowing why, in the loneliness that guarded him from the crowd, in the inner knowing that always pointed right when others chose wrong, in the holy fire that burned for justice, in the wild creativity that built cities no one believed in the quiet strength that carried him through storms, and in that sacred night under the revival tent, when heaven whispered, "You're mine." This was never random. This was written. And now Elias stood not as a boy with questions, but as a man with clarity. He wasn't just remembering. He was returning to the truth of who he had always been. So if you're still carrying the ache, the difference, the wonder, if your childhood held signs too sacred to explain, then you're not watching this by accident. You are the proof that God marks early and reveals in time. If this story reached into your spirit, if it helped you remember who you really are, comment, "I was chosen from childhood." Share it with someone who's still doubting their design, solitude, and remind them the signs were never strange, they were sacred. And if you believe this message must continue, support the journey. Be part of the story heaven is still telling, through voices like yours, because someone's waiting to discover they weren't overlooked, they were hidden, and the time to rise is now.